Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's press conference from number 6 Convent Place. I'm hosting this afternoon's press conference with the Director of Public Health, Dr. Batty. Let me start by wishing all our nurses a very happy International Nurses' Day. It's particularly apposite that we're able to start this press conference sending you all our best wishes without the issues that are facing many other nations who are mourning the loss of nurses and other frontline medical professionals. Thank you all for the work you've done to prepare our health authority for the challenges of dealing with COVID-19. Today, we have published our Unlock the Rock strategy document. It is now available on the government website and social media. The strategy that we have developed is bespoke for Gibraltar. It is designed specifically for Gibraltar. We're able to take the positions we're taking thanks to the current low rate of infections in Gibraltar. In that respect, I can tell you that today, the number of people who are diagnosed as being actively infected with COVID-19 in Gibraltar is still 4. That figure means that for the past 6 days now, we have been in single figures in the active stage of the disease. And that is in the context of greatly increased sampling. We've already carried out 4,352 tests for COVID-19, of which we've received 3,942 results. We've had a total of 148 confirmed cases. 144 of these are now already recovered. There is no one today with confirmed or even suspected COVID-19 in John Ward, in the Nightingale Ward, or in the COVID ICU. Frankly, these are magnificent statistics to date. But we have to be wary of infections increasing and second waves, etc. But what a great day to celebrate International Nurses' Day. Yesterday, I gave the community an overview of the dates provided for in our strategy. Each of the phases I referred you to is divided by a wait and see period of between 3 and 2 weeks. The phases are designed to permit a return to work and a return to social life in a safe and secure way. A gradual way that allows Public Health Gibraltar and the GHA to observe what the effects of the measures that we are taking are and what return of infections we might see during those periods. This is a carefully calibrated, step-by-step approach that will allow us to finesse how we return each sector to normality. I'm particularly pleased that we believe that we will be able to take a posture as from Thursday of next week, which is advisory rather than compulsory. What will happen is that we will this week extend the regulations that affect our over 70-year-olds from Friday the 15th of May to the following Thursday the 21st of May. That will make the regulations affecting all ages coterminous one with the other. And the following week, we will take a different posture, which will mean that you will not be subject to any laws about how you leave your home. But we will still strongly advise you to stay home, because our advice is not changing, even though our legal posture can change. We do not believe that it would be proportional to continue these restrictions against freedom of movement, given the low numbers of infections reported today. And in those circumstances, what we will do in the first week in phase 2 is to repeal those regulations which affect your freedom of movement. But we will maintain the regulations which affect your freedom of association, because underlying these rules will be a regulation restricting gatherings to less than 12. This is important, because we're not yet confident that we can allow large public gatherings. And that has meaningful consequences for things as important to some as religious worship, which will not return until phase 3 at the earliest. I will let the strategy document speak for itself, as I already took you through its sections yesterday. But as we sit here today, I think it's important to reflect on where we are and why we are where we are. At the time we started to impose restrictions in mid-March, we had seen what was happening in China, in Wuhan, and what was happening in Italy. In China, 4,000 people had died. In Italy, the death toll was increasing. It's now reached just shy of 31,000 people in Italy. In Spain, the numbers then were still quite low. In the UK, the issue was just really in the background. But we locked down anyway. We thought it was the right thing to do based on the public health advice. Now, the numbers of dead in Spain represent just shy of 27,000 people. That's the equivalent of the whole adult population of Gibraltar gone in just 5 weeks. In the UK, the number of dead has now reached 32,000. That's the equivalent of the whole population of Gibraltar gone in just 4 weeks. That is the killer that we faced and that we are facing. So I want to express my solidarity again with the people of Spain and the people of the United Kingdom, and indeed with our other neighbour, Morocco, who have lost almost 200 people to date. Each one of those is a life, not just a statistic, not just a number. A life, a friend, a partner or a relative, a father, a son, a mother or a daughter. And we must not lose sight of that horror because we are closer to summer, because it's getting warmer, or because we are starting to unlock. That is the reason why we locked down and turned our lives upside down and inside out. That is why we have restrictions on travel. And that's why this document that we've published today is not about total freedom as from tomorrow. That is not what it provides for. And although we're taking steps to liberalize our position slowly and gradually, we are not changing our advice for that reason. The virus is still out there. So stay at home. That is the safest course. Remember that none of the people who have died of the virus went out to catch the virus or thinking that they would catch the virus whilst they were outside. So please read our document in great detail. Understand what we are doing, why we are permitting some things and some others are not being permitted, and understand from when we are permitting some things and not others. It's also particularly important to note the pauses that we've built into between stages. These are designed to enable us to see if there is new growth of cases which we might consider to be growing at an unmanageable rate. We're not pausing for any reason other than to prudently observe that our actions are not allowing the virus back. And as we move from compulsory to advisory, it will be important to reflect on the work that we've asked our law enforcement agencies to do and how well they have done it. So sincere thanks to the RGP, to the GDP, and to the men and women of HM Customs for their work in the past 6 weeks. I ask you all to please continue to cooperate with law enforcement. The regulations restricting free movement continue in effect for now until a week on Thursday. And thereafter, as I've said before, but this is important, gatherings will still be restricted to 12 people or less for now. As I said yesterday, the document we prepared has been created and populated by our public health professionals and by each of the ministries led by my cabinet team. I'm grateful to all of them. Additionally, we've also benefited from the input of the Leader of the Opposition and his team. I trust that their contributions have assisted in bringing greater clarity to the document in parts. You'll also see that our document also contains our proposals to cut pollution and encourage a more active lifestyle. On those proposals, in respect of Linewall Road, Chatham Counterguard and Europort Avenue, the government and the GSD opposition disagree on the methodology, implementation and consultation, as has been reflected in our respective press releases on the subject. We have not been able to agree on this aspect of the document, which I regret but make no apology for. I think this is the right time to be bold and to pursue these policies designed to deliver healthier lifestyles and less pollution. The Minister for Transport, Vijay Dadyanani, has nonetheless already fixed appointments to meet with Together Gibraltar and the GSD on this subject and with his technical teams in order to consult on the transport aspects of this document. I today also sent an advance copy of our Unlock the Rock document to Ms. Hassan Naan. I should also, before moving on, say how grateful I am to Stephen Pereira and to Selwyn Figueras for their work on the presentation and content of this document, respectively. Moving on now. This afternoon, I've written to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, setting out the government's reasoning on why we should not be subject to the same quarantine provisions as may apply to other countries and will not apply to France and Ireland in respect of arrivals by air into the United Kingdom. I know that the matter of Gibraltar's exemption is actively being pursued in London by the all-party group in Parliament. Sir Bob Neill has written to the Prime Minister also today. Colleagues in the Foreign Office are considering all arguments which may be relevant in support of Gibraltar's position. Also today, the Department of Education has written to university students, given the extraordinary closure of universities on their third maintenance instalment of their scholarships awarded in early March 2020. The maintenance grant is specifically provided to assist students in respect of their expenses whilst studying abroad. The Department of Education is aware that most students return to Gibraltar and that universities have made arrangements so that students can complete course assignments and the remainder of the academic year from home. Many universities have announced that they will be waiving accommodation fees for the last term. For those students in private accommodation, decisions as to whether rent is payable will be taken by landlords, and liability to pay rent may depend on contractual commitments. The result of these decisions is that some students will have no maintenance expenses at all during the current term, whilst others will continue to have full outgoings, in particular rent. The government has therefore decided that in order to ensure budgetary fairness among scholarship students and to preserve financial equity, we must assess each student individually with a view to ascertaining financial commitments outside of Gibraltar during this term. Any sum from the maintenance grant not required to meet those financial commitments will be required to be returned. Each of the amounts recovered will be donated in the student's name to the GHA COVID Fund. The scholarship section will be embarking on an exercise to ascertain the financial commitments abroad for this term and whether the student is entitled to the full or part of the amount awarded for the third maintenance instalment. Each student will be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. This is not a case of one size fits all. We do not want to create hardship for anyone. Indeed, many students and parents have called in before this notice has gone out, volunteering to return the money that has been given to them in the third maintenance grant. The department is seeking information from students at this stage only. The deadline for information to be provided was given as the 1st of June, but that will be extended to the 1st of July as some students are undergoing exams and we do not wish to increase stress or pressure in any way for students. Students will be emailed today informing them that each case will be evaluated on a one-by-one basis. For example, students in halls who have had their accommodation fees waived, which we understand is most of them, will be asked to return their maintenance grants or those parts which they have not used. Alternatively, they will be free to keep them in lieu of their September grant for the next academic year. They will also be told of the extension of time. You should note that there are around 1,000 students and that they each received about £2,000 as the third maintenance instalment. The total paid out is therefore just over £2 million. The Department of Education also want to clarify that this is not intended at all for students who have stayed in their university accommodation in the United Kingdom. Those students only need to confirm that they have been in the United Kingdom, that they have not returned to Gibraltar for the duration of the third term. Finally, today, as you will see from the Unlock the Rock document, the bathing season this year will not start until mid-June, if everything goes well. We're making arrangements for beaches to be available and ready for that date, but not before. We will also be making accessibility arrangements for persons with disabilities, given different potential arrangements this year. We are very conscious of the needs of those with disabilities, as well as the needs of the parents or carers of those with disabilities, and we will be making particular arrangements this year. But it is important, please, to note, ahead of mid-June, that there will not be lifeguards before that date at the beaches. There will also not be the usual beach boys, and so pleasure boats and jet skis may be coming in closer to shore. If you are bathing, please be aware of this. Now I will allow the Director of Public Health, Dr. Sohail Bhatti, to give you his own introduction and views in respect of our Unlock the Rock document before we take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're well. And I don't usually write things down. I try to say things as they come into my head. So if I look down, please forgive me. But I think we're at this stage where we're coming up for some release. And I wish that the release was as simple as the lockdown was. We may think that it was complicated, but actually what happened was that people instinctively took to the trenches in order to protect themselves and went back to their homes. It's much, much more difficult, complicated. Would that I were a politician. The world is so much more complex for them than for anyone else. However, there isn't a roadmap that is evidence-based. That's clear, and you can see that because you can see that all across the world people are weaving their own routes. This is more like a chessboard, where there are many, many different pieces arranged in many different ways, and there are many ways to win, just as there are many ways to lose. And we don't actually know, because no one's really explained this game to us before, what the actual rules, all the rules are. We're discovering some of them as we go along. So this is a best endeavours Gibraltar version of what we think is going to be appropriate for us as we go forward. Now, the point is that we must be cautious, we mustn't rush, we mustn't be going too fast, because there is the risk that we might fall, which is why what has been built into this route has been times for pause, times for reflection, times to look to see what is happening. I think that we've got to remember that this virus incubates for 7 days and up to 14 days, which means that when we are reflecting, when we are looking at what is happening, the virus it will respond, but we have to anticipate where it will be in 1 week's time. One thing we can be sure of is that we have successfully contained this virus already. We went into that lockdown, and we did it with a complete lockdown. But it's not something we would wish to happen again. The cost was horrendous. Many of us have suffered from the isolation that resulted. It's not something that we would wish to happen again. And that's why Public Health Gibraltar is establishing and reinforcing 3 key services that will help us navigate our way through this arena that we find ourselves with. The first one is the Public Health Laboratory. This is based at the University of Gibraltar and works in concert with the GHA's own diagnostic laboratory service. What it will do for us is it will do testing at scale. What I wish to do is to screen 1 to 2% of our population every day. We will need to make sure that we get the results back as soon as possible. We're aiming for about 4 hours. So we're aiming to do at least 300 tests every day. And what we are trying to do is swab those people with the highest risk of exposure. And because the infection is now quite rare, we've done about 1,400 swabs in the last few days and only found 4 cases. That actually means, therefore, it's our frontline services we're focusing our attention on, because they are the people that meet the most number of people. They are most likely to have the virus by dint of contact and exposure. But it also means those people that are involved with care, such as those that work in the ERS, the care agency, and the GHA. What we're trying to do is we will take swabs at intervals based on a balance of risk and exposure. So we're proposing to do some groups once a month, and we're going to, so in effect, if you're a worker for the GHA or ERS, then you will be swabbed on a monthly interval to see if you've got a current infection or not. And if you work in some of the other frontline services, it'll be once every 7 weeks. That service is therefore designed to give us some early warning of any rising infection. There are other ways we can assess that. For example, what is happening in the Campo area will also inform us as to what might be happening. But this is alerting as to whether we're going too far or too fast. And when also if there are increasing numbers of infection coming across a border. And actually the issue is that when you have your swab, what you're doing is carrying out your civic duty. And your civic duty is to protect your fellow Gibraltarians, because you will get your result back within half a day. And if you're positive, what will happen is you'll be asked to go home and self-isolate for 10 days. That will mean also your contacts. And your first contacts are the members in your own household. So you will all have to isolate for 10 days. We will effectively build a hermetic seal around the infection where it is. We will also, through our contact tracing service, contact those people that are what we would define as close contacts, and we would ask them also to self-isolate. Not their families, just those individuals. So there's clearly an interest here in maintaining your social distance, because if you have a coffee or you're drinking over a water cooler and you've spent more than 15 minutes quite close to that individual, sometime later on, if that individual is found to be positive, you may well then be asked to isolate away from work. Contact as a word is important here, because the contact tracing service I've just alluded to will arise out of the 111 service. And basically their job is to collect all the information we can for the previous 48 hours of all our positive cases. So we're going to swab like mad as much as we can, and that will throw up some positives, and we will then contact those positives on the telephone and ask them who was around in the last 48 hours that had been a close contact, in other words, within 2 meters of someone for 15 minutes. So just to reinforce, social distancing is important, not just because you are trying to protect people, but it will have an impact on you if you're found to be positive subsequent to a positive case being found in a colleague at work. It does mean that as many as 25% of us could be in isolation at any one time, but that is the price that the 75% have to pay for the 75%'s freedom. Okay. I do particularly want to thank Dr. Danny Casaglia and Dr. Nick Cortez at this time, because both of them have worked tremendously hard, heroically, to help their fellow Gibraltarians in getting both these services up and running. And I hope, particularly when we do thank in the traditional fashion at 8 o'clock now, we do remember them particularly. The other thing we're doing is, while we are going to be swabbing, we're going to have a swabbing service that's enhanced. At the beginning of May, we had tested just under 3,000 people in the 60 days of lockdown that we'd had, thereabouts. We're now going to do 2,000 every week, just to give you a size of the scale that we're going to move at. We are going to expand the capacity of the drive-through, and we're also going to need additional capacity in terms of people that may have to visit some of the sites where people work. Finally, what we're planning to do is screen the entire population of Gibraltar with a new antibody test. What that antibody test we have on order, what that antibody test will do is it will enable us to establish whether people who had that terrible flu at Christmas, and I've heard this many, many occasions, was actually COVID or not. And what the antibody test will do is will reveal whether you had or you hadn't. Unfortunately, it's a blood test, much as none of us really like needles, but I think, to be honest, most of us would like to know how and what. We'd like to know if our children have had it. It transforms, in many ways, the way that you address the rest of your day if you have some assessment of the antibody status that you have. So this is a brave new world. It's one where we will need to live with COVID-19, but we've got a set of tools. We will have temperature monitoring, and as you've seen, we have temperature monitoring going on. We're encouraging the use of masks in enclosed spaces where you can't keep social distance. We're going to have rigorous swabbing for the whole community. We will also have the antibody test. This is a brave new world, but not one where we need to live in fear as time has gone on. One of the things that the community of Gibraltar has managed to do is buy itself a bit of time, and antivirals, I'm fully confident that there'll be more antivirals coming on the scene that will be shown to be effective, which will also mean were you to fall ill. And remember, we've got tremendous capacity in the hospital now. We've got ventilators that we wouldn't have dreamed we would have managed to get when we started on this journey. There are facilities available if you were to fall ill, and I hope that no one does fall ill, to be honest, but we are where we are. We live in this world, and I'd just like to say it has been the honour of my life to help and work in this setting to help the people of Gibraltar. I'm just the son of a Pakistani bus driver and a nurse, and I think it's been a huge honour to serve you. I'm not intending to go anywhere, by the way. It does sound like a... But I just want to make sure that actually we move on this journey together, and we're only on phase one of this journey, this first part of the journey. The journey as we move on ahead is fraught with the unknown. We need to help each other. We need to work with each other. We need to be brave as well, because I do appreciate that a lot of people were fearful when this virus came. We did not know a lot about what this virus would do, and we do now. So thank you, everyone, for everything you've done. You've helped us get this far. Let's all see where we're going together and help each other.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Batty. And so we come to questions from members of the press who are assembled here with us this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to see you all back in the room.
Chief Minister, you will have seen that Spain yesterday in its Boletín de Estado announced that there would have to be a 2-week period of quarantine for anyone entering Spain. Can you tell us what your thoughts are on how this will affect Gibraltar because of the people going back and forth across the border?
Thank you. The bulletin that you're referring to does not relate to land frontiers. It relates only to arrivals by air and by sea to Spain. It's very specific in setting that out. Arrivals by land continue to be preserved in the way that they were before, in the suspension of the Schengen acquis by Spain, the application of the Schengen acquis by Spain, and indeed many other states. I think 15 of the Schengen states have, or 8 out of 15 of the Schengen states have suspended Schengen on the public health ground. That includes France, for example. So they have a rule in relation to land frontiers which is different to the rule that they've now imposed in the context of arrivals by air and by sea. You will permit me to just reflect on the fact that given the non-performance of the obligations Spain acquired in Cordoba, there are no flights between Gibraltar Airport and Spain, and indeed no ferry between Gibraltar and Spain, which was operating between Gibraltar and Algeciras. And therefore, that particular Boletín Oficial del Estado setting out that rule is of no practical application whatsoever to Gibraltar. Gibraltar was carved out from the application of the suspension of the movement of people in and out of Spain through land frontiers, as Andorra was carved out, in order to permit continued transit. In particular, that affects cross-frontier workers for a particular reason, that Spain has rules in place which only allowed you at a particular time to move, to go to a place of work, or to go to shop, etc., if you were a resident of Spain. Those rules haven't changed. So you can only enter Spain at the moment if you are a resident of Spain, or indeed if you're going to carry out a job which relates to the transport industry or some other necessary industry. So not only has Spain got a quarantine, it's got a restriction on who can come into Spain in any event, but that's in relation to air and sea services. We're working, as I've told you already, in communicating with Spanish authorities as to when the lifting of the restrictions on movements in and out of Spain through land frontiers occurs, so that Gibraltar will have the benefit of that. And despite that, of course, movement of cross-frontier workers has been able to continue, and movement of people, even of British nationality, who are properly resident in Spain, has been able to continue without a problem.
From the Chronicle. As discussed yesterday, certain establishments will be able to reopen under phases 2 and 3 of the Unlocking the Rock regime, but certain restrictions and conditions. I think a lot of people expected these to be set out in the document, and in some areas they're not, and it just says additional details will be provided in the future. Why are these details not in the document, and what do people do when they need to use these establishments but are unsure how and when they can?
So okay, the lesson for us is that if we set something out in a document as a rule today, it will probably be more stringent than it needs to be in the context of some of the establishments that we have in Gibraltar. And therefore, what we're trying to do by not setting out in detail in the document what the criteria will be is to actually be more flexible and therefore support business more. So we're looking at, for example, the rule of whether you have to be 1 metre apart or 2 metres apart. I mean, this is all about whether you're outside, whether you're inside, what it is that you're trying to protect yourself from. And I think the sensible approach that we're taking with Public Health Gibraltar's advice and with the advice of any of the authorities that are relevant in each sector, so you have different relevant sectors when you're dealing with construction or when you're dealing with a bar, cafeteria or a restaurant, will be able to make bespoke arrangements for that sector. We're not yet in the situation where those sectors are going to open. We have more time to develop our criteria in a way that continues to be flexible, and I envisage that we'll be issuing documentation in respect of each of those sectors. So there'll be a rule for gyms, there'll be a rule for restaurants, there are rules for bars, which will be slightly different to the rules for restaurants, and what we want to do is to retain that maximum flexibility. And as we get closer to those dates, and as we understand more about how the virus is performing, as we're testing more, we may be able to be more flexible than we would be if we were very circumscribed now about what it is that we were setting out. But I should tell you that in addition to the Unlock the Rock document, which is now live on our social media and on our webpage, we hope to be able to have out in a little while, literally in a few hours, a summary of this in a way that is much easier to understand. So, you know, I'm a Gibraltarian. Whenever I buy a gadget, I tend not to read the manual. I tend to go to the quick release guide. So our quick release guide will be available online and on our social media very soon.
Dr. Batty, I just want to ask one question in respect of testing at the frontier. How has that proceeded? We have received reports that the thermometer testing machinery, like the scanners, didn't actually work unless the person was stood there for a reasonable period of time. Is there any truth in this? How many people have been sent back? And do you expect a greater influx of workers over the next few weeks?
Do you mind, John, if I take that question, because it's about immigration, and I'm the Minister with responsibility for
go for
immigration. And we're not doing any testing at the frontier.
Yeah, but the scanning, yeah? There was scanning.
Well, no, that's different. One thing is to have a
temperature scanning is what I
mechanism
meant.
for temperature scanning, which takes people as they walk through, and quite another to suggest that you're going to stop people at a frontier and test them with the consequences that may have for flow. Now, that may be something that comes at a different stage. Remember, I've always emphasized in the context of answering questions as to immigration, that matters in immigration work on a reciprocal basis. So if we were made subject to testing, we might make people subject to testing. We're going to have wide-scale testing, as Dr. Batty has set out, of different sectors, and some of those sectors include a lot of cross-frontier workers, but we've been very keen in the work that we've done not to create any barriers to frontier flow. And therefore, we're not doing any testing whatsoever at the frontier. And in the context of the question you asked about temperature scanning, I mean, we're satisfied that the system that we established is a system that worked. It didn't work perhaps as well as we might want it to, in the sense that we were setting up a mechanism which involved a handheld temperature device which was put on a tripod as we started this process. We are now investigating the possibility of temperature scanning using devices which are established as part of the thoroughfare through which you walk as you come into Gibraltar, through the airport, through the port, or indeed through the frontier. And those mechanisms are also more aesthetically pleasing. You're not just looking at a thermometer standing there, but there's been no concerns as to the time that somebody needs to be standing in front of the scanner or any of that reported to us. The technology is quite advanced, and it does produce the result that you see in some of the television reports of how these thermometers worked. Whether they're the one type or the other type, they're still doing the work that you need, which is giving you a moving picture of the temperature of a variety of different subjects moving all at the same time.
And have you had any people turn back? You did say at one point that you would turn back people.
We
who
haven't had
temperature-
any reports whatsoever of people coming in with temperatures above the temperature that would be normal who have been turned back.
A question from YGTV for Dr. Bhatti. The over 70s, the immunosuppressed, and now the obese are being advised to stay at home. How many people in Gibraltar fall into these categories, and how realistic is it for them to remain in lockdown for the foreseeable future, especially when the rest of the population will be enjoying greater freedoms?
Well, if you read the Unlock the Rock document, there is a degree of freedom that's been built in at different phases. So I don't think it's actually exactly accurate to say that we're not giving people that freedom. However, I was just looking at the figures that we've got. The last time we did a health survey of the population was in 2015, so it's a few years out of date. But according to the best estimate we've got, for adults over the age of 18, there are 9,500 adults that are obese, and who are overweight, and 6,500 that are obese. That's quite a considerable proportion of the population. We're not saying that you shouldn't go out. We're saying that you have to take precautions and be careful. And actually, I suppose if motivation was needed, then you've got the motivation to lose some weight. And it is sometimes purely about the calories that we consume, and that is actually at the end of the day the easiest way to lose a little bit of weight and gain some of your freedom. Now, the 70-year-olds we've protected as a community. It's something that 70-year-olds themselves have recognised, and some have and some haven't. But actually, it's a social form of lockdown that they've experienced. So, as the Chief Minister has said, it is advisory, it's not compulsory. And we've released an awful lot of those compulsory mechanisms. I hope over time, as more and more information is percolating back to people in terms of how much virus we have or we haven't got, that will bolster people's self-confidence, and they may then go out to be able to enjoy the great Gibraltar that there is.
I'll just tell you something. I think it's important that we share these thoughts. I started this process at a BMI of 27. I'm at a BMI of 32 today. The lockdown has not done me any good, and I'm sure that it's done a lot of people a lot of good because they've been doing a lot of walking, and some people no good. I'm now going to make sure that I take myself out of the risk category and I go back to not accepting all the biscuits that Amy buys and looking after myself a little more, and you'll be seeing a lot of pictures of my treadmill on my Twitter feed as from tomorrow.
Thank you. The next question was sent in from the Panorama on behalf of a reader and is for the Chief Minister. It is assumed that the reason to reduce car pollution is to benefit the people, but Linewall Road is not a built-up residential area. In fact, from the American War Memorial southwards, there's a huge garage and boulevards. Unlike in other areas where high-rise residential buildings might make it more appropriate to have an anti-pollution policy. Don't you agree?
Of course I don't. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken the measure that I'm proposing. And the reason I don't is because Linewall Road is full of people. Even though it may not be full of residential areas, it is full of people moving to and from work. It's full of people moving their children. It's full of people moving from a pedestrianised area like Main Street to a park like Commonwealth Park. So for that reason, I think it is the right move to explore the possibility of bringing that reduction in pollution to all of the people who use that area, and indeed to all of the people who live not just on Linewell Road, because we mustn't look at this in a one-dimensional sense. Pollution does not stay on the road in which it is created. It flows into the areas around, and Panorama's own office is just off Linewell Road, and there's a lot of people who work in that area and who go to leisure in that area, Main Street, etc. So if I agreed with the reader, I wouldn't be proposing what I'm proposing. I disagree with the reader, and I disagree with others who think that this is a bad idea. I want to leave behind a better Gibraltar, a greener Gibraltar, a child-friendly Gibraltar, and these are the baby steps that we have to take in that direction. This is only the beginning, and I find myself in a world where everybody nods when Greta Thunberg talks and thinks that it's all a very good idea, and yet when the time comes for action, we all think the action should affect other people, and it shouldn't affect our parking space, it shouldn't affect our car. Walking is about seeing everybody else walk whilst we sit in our car, watching them go by. And, I think the time has come to wake up and smell the coffee. It's about time that we realized that we have to fix our planet ourselves.
Dr. Bhatti, I want to ask you about masks. There's a particular section in the Unlock the Rock document dedicated to the advice given on masks, not just by the World Health Organization, but also by the Gibraltar government and your department. There are, however, many countries around the world, including our neighbors, Spain, who make masks in public compulsory. Why has Gibraltar not gone down this route and is suggesting that wearing masks in some circumstances and not others, perhaps sending mixed messages?
So the problem with any kind of information that's coming in is that there's always a matter of interpretation as to what weight you apply to the different bits of information that's coming in. I am of the view, and I had to be drawn to this view reluctantly over a few weeks ago, that the evidence was now tilting in favour of the use of masks. The evidence is that infection spreads, particularly from asymptomatic people, in an internal environment, not an external environment. So the use of masks externally seems like an unnecessary restriction signal, if you like, for people to impose that psychological constraint that says be fearful. And I don't think we should fear this particular virus. So the use of masks in public areas does do nothing to enhance your safety or your chances of passing it on, because the evidence base for you passing on in a public area is very limited. But where there is evidence, which is in air-conditioned spaces, in enclosed spaces, what we're saying, it's not unreasonable, is to keep your germs to yourself by some kind of enclosure, which is a mask, but mindful that everyone can get a surgical mask. You can make your own accoutrement as long as it's cleaned on a regular basis. And the other thing is, don't think just by wearing a mask you suddenly become immortal and you don't need to do anything, because even as you have watched, I've touched my face on many, many occasions, and that's where the virus comes from. It comes from the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and so you need to ensure that we've got rigorous hand cleansing, whether it's a gel or hand washing. So you do your hand washing, you can go into a shop or any other area because you have cleaned the virus off. But as soon as you start touching your face and you start touching everything else, that's what stops. That's what creates the contamination of the environment. So keep the mask on in order to ensure you're not passing it on. You may have it and you may not know that you've got it, and wash your hands regularly. Really simple stuff, you know, it's not 21st century spaceship stuff, but it makes sense and it's coherent, and I hope I've explained it clearly so that there's no ambiguity about it.
Just to clear up one further ambiguity, sorry, Chief Minister, do you want to carry on?
Well, simply to say that if you look at the document, there are parts of the document where we are specifically saying that masks use is advised, and in some instances where we're saying that masks must be used, and that's worked out on the basis of different circumstances, but we're not saying where mask use is prohibited. So in other words, if somebody thinks that their own view and interpretation is contrary to the view and interpretation that we've given, and they want to wear a mask outside, we're not prohibiting anyone from wearing a mask, or indeed a face covering which they've made for themselves if they feel more comfortable in doing so.
The question that I was going to ask just now was, can you advise or can you clear up the ambiguity on where specifically mask use is now a legal requirement according to this new document?
No, there is not going to be a circumstance where there is a legal requirement, because what we're going to do is we're going to provide for that in permits. So if you look at the mechanism that's put in place in respect of places of business, forget the general area, the places of business, what we're saying is in those places of business, you are required to have a permit to operate, and the permit is going to carry the requirement. So it'll be imputed into the law in that way. As we move into a different posture, for example, when we get to the issue of public transport, we may have an issue. Public transport comes back in phase 3, I think. We will then potentially have to determine whether we make it mandatory to wear masks on public transport, whether we simply rely on social distancing or a combination of the two.
Just to follow up on the announcement about university students being asked to repay the third instalment of their maintenance grant. This is typically the time of year when students would be looking for rental accommodation for the next academic year and signing agreements to that effect. What is your guidance for students in those situations when we don't yet know how the next academic year is going to play out?
So this is why it's so important that we do this on a case-by-case basis. You've got 1,000 students, and given what we've learned from dealing with the beat COVID measures relating to business, you probably have 1,000 different life stories that you need to understand and interpret in order to bring fairness to the equation. I told you also earlier that we'd had many people contact the department voluntarily and say, look, I'm back in Gibraltar, I don't need this money, can I please give it back to the government? I mean, there's a very large number of people doing that. So there are some students who feel they don't need to keep the funds. There are some students who will need to keep the funds because they will have spent the funds for the reasons that the funds are given. They're stayed in the UK, they're continuing to do their exams from there. And there are other students who will be in intermediate situations. Some of them will have had their rent waived and will not need the money for the deposit for next year. Some of them will have had their rent waived and, as you say, will be looking to use that to pay the deposit for next year. So what we want to do is to bring about fairness and social justice, because what we don't want to do, and I think everybody would agree is unfair, is that a student who had the money returned and is not going to use it for rent for next year is simply going to keep that money and use it for his general living expenses in Gibraltar once the bars and restaurants reopen. That would not be fair. That would not be doing social justice in the context of spending money in these difficult moments. And that's why what we want to do is to talk to students individually, and that's why the Department of Education is going to have those individual conversations with students to ensure that what we do is fair and doesn't cause any hardship to anyone. Thank you.
And Dr. Patty, I just wanted to ask, considering the Unlock the Rock document, at what point would you decide to reverse these unlocking of Gibraltar's lockdown? Would it be, is there like a certain threshold you would be looking for in terms of reversing this lockdown? Would it be like 100 cases or a certain amount of people in certain areas which are getting infected? Do you have such information?
It's not my
or is
job,
this hypothetical?
Right, so it's not my job to lock or unlock. I mean, ultimately, it's the government of Gibraltar's responsibility. My job's to advise on the basis of context. And the context here, I put it in the document, the context here is what is happening at that particular time. So, for example, if there is a surge of cases, wave 2 in the Campo area, that is significant. And we would have, because we've done and will be doing a lot of swabbing and analysis, we would have early warning of an increase and a rise in cases. Likewise, if the number of cases is growing on a regular basis over 4 or 5 days, that's also a warning sign. I have had my analyst have a look at this, and the problem that we face is Gibraltar's such a small community that there's a large element of random chance when you start to look at trends, that actually if we got 10 cases a day, it's just as likely to go back to 0 as it is to go to 20. But once we do get to 20 active cases, what the evidence seems to indicate is that the 20 active cases may well lead to a surge. And actually, it's not just that. If there were only 20 cases and there were no other cases around, then that context is important. So we've also said that if there are 400, 500, 1,000 cases, 1,000 cases probably maximal, that means there are more opportunities for the virus to spread, because not everyone will remember absolutely everybody they met. Some people may be untruthful. And what may happen is that there'll be more cases out there. So 20 cases in that context, 10 cases in that context represents something more than if, for example, tomorrow we had 10 cases, when we know we've done literally thousands of swabs. We haven't got any virus. We've just had a lucky hit, if you like. We hit a particular shift or a particular establishment that had the virus. So we are reviewing it. But certainly my job is, as it's always been, to advise the Chief Minister and the Cabinet, and he's always been fulsome in wanting to listen to the advice that we give, and advise when it looks risky. Because my considered view, my constant view is that the world remains a dangerous place, even if we've built ourselves a rather protected environment. The world will always remain a dangerous place, so we will continue to have to watch what's happening both out there and our response to it.
I think you'll see that we've set that out in the terms that Suhail has just explained in pages 16 and 17 of the document. So people will have that objectively before them, so that they understand that the Cabinet is looking at these numbers. We get every morning something called a situation report, which sets out exactly what of our frontline agencies in that swabbing have seen any active cases, how many people we have in self-isolation in the community, the numbers in every single ward in the hospital, etc. And that will continue, because we need to, even when we step back from the posture of a major incident, we will still keep a view across all of these areas. I mean, it's very likely that these are things that the Public Health Gibraltar will be looking at if they tend to go away, to guard against the rise again. But these numbers are being looked at in detail to ensure that we see a second wave or a first wave. I mean, we probably dealt with a cluster rather than a wave, luckily, but to see that coming towards us and be able to act again if we needed to, hopefully without having to lock down again, hopefully by being able to do, remember, this is a question of testing, tracking, and then isolating. So hopefully by isolating that cluster when we see it appear, and not have to move to a general lockdown again.
I suppose to a certain extent, contact tracing will help with that once it gets
That's
running.
what will tell you what the identity and nature of the cluster is.
Indeed. But what would be the procedure? Would you move down a phase, or would you just go to full lockdown?
I think it's impossible for us to answer that question in the abstract. I'll tell you why. The way that we have designed each of the phases, there are different things which are going on. And so there's a reason for that, and the reason for building in the pause. If you're able to identify where the cluster comes from, you may be able to identify which of the restrictions you lifted gave rise to it, and you would seek to simply reimpose that restriction. That might mean going back 2 phases in respect of that particular restriction, but allowing all the other restrictions to continue unabated, because you don't need to go back. For example, if you've identified a cluster that's happening in one particular self-contained construction site, you don't need to close down every bar in Gibraltar and every shop in Gibraltar if you have been able to identify that that's where it comes from. So you say, right, I'm not even going to close down construction, I'm going to close down that site. If you see that there are 4 or 5 sites where this is happening, you say to yourself, right, this is obviously coming in with construction workers, let's deal with construction. Now, some construction you opened in phase 1, but you might still leave the cafeterias open if you're in phase 4. So we will therefore have the levers, hopefully, and I think this is the point that Suhail is making, in a country like Gibraltar, you can see those levers and you can pull those threads and hopefully control a cluster in that way without having to move back to a general lockdown, which we can't discard. We can't discard having to go back a whole phase. We have to be able to do reverse gear. That's what we're saying in our document. But of course, those again are dramatic things. I mean, when you think about what we did in mid-March, that had never been done before in our history. Simply because we've now done it in March doesn't mean we are going to feel freer to be able to do it in July or August. We're going to always resist going to a general lockdown if there are better and more proportional ways to do so. Indeed, constitutionally, the argument should be that we were not entitled to restrict people's freedoms generally if there is a more proportional way of addressing the issue that we need to cure. Thank you.
A question from the Panorama for Dr. Batty. Many people remember that it was Dr. Batty who made the suggestion that the whole of Gibraltar would get the coronavirus, which caused serious concern and suffering throughout the population. Is he still of that opinion? Because there has been no apology from him.
Well, I suppose it'd be only... I remain constant in that view, actually. I think I've remained consistent that I still believe that everyone will get this virus, particularly in Gibraltar. We are not over this virus. It hasn't finished. It is still out there, and it's still spreading. The number of people that are found in Africa, for example, still very low. Things that are reported in India are very low. So I remain constant that I think there may well be waves. Previous pandemics have shown waves coming back once people have managed to get rid of it. But I make an observation. And an observation is if the fear that's been created has helped people, particularly the over 70s, protect themselves, then the one thing that differentiates us has been the fact that we've had, thank God, no deaths. And that the Chief Minister said this very clearly at the start. Every life is valuable to us. This represents a golden resource. It's our memory as a community. We honour and respect our elderly. So I say that it would be difficult to apologise for not having a death. And if we only look at the Campo area, there have been 33 deaths on a larger population, and only they've had cases perhaps not as large as they've had in Madrid, 200 odd cases, but 33 deaths. So if the fear has instilled in people that degree of self-protection and it has driven us to protect our most vulnerable people, I think I would pass on that opportunity for the moment.
In fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to thank Dr. Batty for the way that he dealt with this issue in the early stages, raising to the attention of the Minister for Public Health and then the Minister for Civil Contingencies and the Cabinet, the concerns that he had about how the numbers that we were seeing in Wuhan and subsequently more worryingly in Italy might manifest in Gibraltar if there were no constraints imposed, if there were no controls imposed of the sorts that we were starting to see emerge in Italy. So I think what we need to be alive to is the need to understand now in early May where we were in early to mid-March and always put ourselves in the understanding that we had then of the virus and what it was doing and what it might have done in Gibraltar if we had continued unabated to go about our daily business. And thank Dr. Batty for the influence that he had in the decisions that we made. Without that advice, we would not have had the power to engage those parts of our legislation, of our constitution, that enable us to restrict the freedom of movement. We might then have found ourselves in a very difficult situation. And Doctor has had a number of deaths as well, similar to Gibraltar. If you look at what's happened in Belgium, in Italy, and in the United Kingdom, and in Spain, and you look at that in terms of deaths per million, Belgium, I think, has had in the region of 760 odd deaths per million when I last checked. It's the worst instance per million of deaths, even worse than the United States and the United Kingdom because of the larger populations. If you transpose that to Gibraltar, it means 22 deaths in Gibraltar, right? And that's Belgium with restrictions on movement. If you look at the Spanish numbers, which 560 odd per million, that translates to somewhere in the high teens of deaths in Gibraltar. Look, when we thought we'd had a death in Gibraltar, I will always remember that morning when I thought we'd lost the first Gibraltarian in Gibraltar to coronavirus, because unfortunately we have lost a Gibraltarian to COVID outside of Gibraltar. But when I thought we'd lost a Gibraltarian in Gibraltar on my watch to COVID, I was very disappointed. My aim is to keep a clean sheet against this killer. And with the advice of Dr. Batty, with the work of my fellow ministers, with the support of the opposition, and with the support of law enforcement, and in particular the work of colleagues in the GHA and elsewhere in the public sector, we've done it. But we've done it because we were alive to the danger in mid-March. So far from an apology, a big thank you from Gibraltar.
The final question is from YGTV and is also for Dr. Batty. You mentioned the plans to conduct antibody testing. Are you able to say when this will start and how long the process will take?
So we're going to do it for the whole of the population of Gibraltar, so you can appreciate that it requires a fair degree of organising. We have got the tests on order. I'm looking towards my colleagues in the GHA, the laboratory, the swabbers, the phlebotomists. There's quite a lot of organisation that needs to be done. We first need to get the tests, and then we need to prove that we understand how that test works, what's the best way of taking the sample, how much of a sample we'll get. My anticipation is that I hope before the autumn we would have embarked on this, and our aim would be to get through the testing, the venipuncture testing on an industrial scale. Hopefully the experience we've had with swabbing and testing will help us. So I would hope that it wouldn't take many weeks, but it will require a lot of organising, and we're going to have to go through a lot of detail around who gets the test, when and how and where, how we report the test back, etc. But there are people working on it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having joined us this afternoon. Unlock the Rock is the document that's now available on the government website and on our social media pages. It's a document of which the government is rightly proud. We've developed it in support of Public Health Gibraltar's attitude to stopping the coronavirus, taking the lives of any Gibraltarians, stopping the spread of that virus, and slowly returning to our normal lives, although with some changes which I hope will make them better. You can consult that document now on our social media or website, and I sincerely hope that you'll be able to look at the detail of it. Depending on what industry you're in, depending on what your concerns are, there should be something in there for everybody that needs some advice. There will also be an abridged version, a chart that will show you the phases to unlocking that we hope to be making available on our website and on our different social media channels during the course of today. Thank you for joining us once again this afternoon at number 6 Convent Place. Soon there will not be press conferences at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'll all be able to go about our business, which in my case will no longer mean having a lovely cup of tea with a chocolate biscuit anymore. Thank you and good afternoon.